It is absolutely wonderful to be here. I was so happy to be invited, and looking at all the things that you do, really impressed. It's incredible. I wasn't aware of what you did until I was invited, so it's really nice to be here. Just a little bit about me. I have worked with the British Psychological Society in developing and putting together the Crisis, Disaster and Trauma section. And that's something that you might consider joining if you are interested in joint working, because like yourselves, we're very keen that the group is multidisciplined, because actually dealing with trauma requires you to deal with lots of other things. Just to give you some idea of my background, I actually was also involved with the earlier terrorist attack in Manchester, with the Manchester bombing a number of years ago, more than 10 years ago, I guess. And one of the things that came to my mind when actually the more recent event occurred was, what is that going to be doing to those people that were involved in that initial event? And I think we've got to be very mindful that it isn't just the people that were actually there that experienced trauma. It is also the people that have been in similar situations in the past, and also people that can imagine being in that kind of situation. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to find, or for you to find, that there's a big increase in the number of people that have got psychological difficulties going forward because of their kind of secondary trauma of actually seeing what's happened. Because if they could imagine themselves or their families or their children being at that event, then it's likely that that is actually going to be quite traumatizing for them. But you can see some of the other situations. This year has been really difficult in that we've had a number in London where I work, a number of attacks in London, plus the tremendous impact of the Grenfell fire, which is still taking up a lot of the time of the psychologists and the emergency workers who I mainly work with. It isn't easy if you're a firefighter and you arrive at the scene of a fire of this nature and you don't have fire equipment that will allow you to put out fires high up in a tower block, and where the wisdom had always been that you stay in your flat or in your room, because we can rescue you much easier from there than actually if you try and escape. So it did cause a lot of difficulties to both the firefighters and the other emergency workers. So what kind of events are traumatic? Well, it's very clear that there are major disasters that occur, the terrorist attack, the big fires, the aircraft crashes and train crashes. And those are pretty easy for us to imagine. But you know, there are other natural events which also cause problems. I happen to come from Cumbria, so I'm a northerner by birth. And you don't hear so much about the impact of flooding. But if you live in an area which is regularly flooded, as happens in Carlisle or in Cockermouth, in various places in Cumbria, the trauma of losing your house, your property, of this unpredictability of these events is really something that causes major trauma to you, and much more difficult to kind of understand because of the nature of it. The other area I work in a lot is in the area of secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. I work with police officers who are dealing with online child abuse, so the impact of day by day looking at thousands of pictures of children being abused sexually has a cost to pay, and it's important that we provide the right kind of help for people. But anyone supporting victims of trauma, which include all of you here, also can be affected And we need to be really careful when we're doing this kind of work that we have the right kind of support available for us and that we understand the impact of what can happen. So in addition to people like yourselves, I'm also looking after people that deal with accident investigation in the commercial area, in working with teachers who are hearing children talking about what's happened to them, and in social work. And it's kind of interesting that people who do this kind of support very often feel that they don't need the help. They're the last people, they're fine, but they're not fine. They're not fine. And it has an impact in the way that they do their work, which I'll be talking about a bit later. But beyond that, there's the everyday traumas that happen in people's lives that you'll be picking up all the time. And for the person that is traumatized, it doesn't really matter whether your trauma is a personal trauma, that it's something that you were attacked on the way home, or something that's happened to a family member, or if that was part of a bigger event that has got lots of publicity. And I think for some people, the fact that their traumas are not really regarded in the same way is quite difficult for them to accept, because actually, if you lost your husband or family in a car crash, and people just say, well, that's just an accident, that actually feels as though you're not being heard at all. And I think it's really important that we don't differentiate between the victims of trauma, because each trauma is a personal trauma. There isn't such a thing as a disaster trauma. There's just trauma that people feel. So is the trauma that you're dealing with organizational or it's personal? There is a massive difference if your trauma occurred because you are an employee. There is this kind of very archaic terms about master and slave relationships, or master and servant, sorry, not slave, master and servant relationship that occurs in organizations. That means that this duty of care is there, that you should be protecting your employees. So it's additional duty of care as would be in place if it was just a member of the community. So what the Health and Safety at Work Act says is that every employer shall ensure that his employees are provided with such health surveillance as is appropriate, having regard to the risks to their health and safety, which are identified by assessments. Now, this actually is really important, because that is saying that because psychological and physical conditions and harm are treated in the same way, that we should be undertaking health assessments and surveillance for psychological as well as physical conditions. In organizations, health surveillance is common. People will have their eyesight and their hearing and various other things tested depending on the nature of their job. But there is very little psychological surveillance, and I think that organizations that aren't undertaking surveillance and screening are actually not meeting their duty of care. And that would go for health authorities as well, in my view. So what's required if you are actually undertaking health surveillance in an organisation? There are 4 areas that you need to be doing, and this is very much like any other sort of risk assessment, that you need to plan, you need to develop your policies, your systems and your procedures, your training and support as part of the programme of support. You need to be able to identify those people and groups that might be at higher risk than others, and that could be because of the nature of their job or because of them personally. So, for example, if someone is pregnant and their job is viewing child abuse images, that might be something that you need to do something about. You need to check how people are being affected, which is where the psychological screening and surveillance comes into play. And then you need to monitor and evaluate the information that you're receiving. And in my view, this should be including benchmarking and quality assurance and moving things forward. One of the other things that affects the way that people are affected by trauma is to see whether this is actually something that's intentional or it just happened by chance. Because the way that people feel about an incident is very much affected in whether they feel that this was somebody doing something intentionally in order to harm me. So obviously a terrorist attack can be experienced in that way, an armed robbery or a rape or domestic violence. So there's very much a personal identification that this situation happened because this person wanted to harm me in some way. But other incidents can also become regarded as as an intentional or something that should not have happened and the person did not take adequate care. So for example, if there's a drunk driving situation, the people involved, the victims of that, may well look to the person that caused the death or the injury as having done something intentional if they didn't take due care and attention, if they were drunk, if they had taken drugs, if they didn't have a safe vehicle that they were driving. And the same thing goes for things like if you take the Paddington rail crash, where there were problems with the tracks. The attention then is put on the people that should have done something to prevent the situation. And of course we have exactly that situation with Grenfell, where the responsibility is being seen as being due to the organisation, to the local authority not using the correct cladding. So this kind of emotional response to the organisation or the person that should have done something brings about a kind of anger and directed thought against that person, which makes it much more difficult if you're handling the trauma, because that anger and that feeling of anger towards people causes them to hold on to more of the trauma for a much longer period of time. Does that kind of make sense to you? So it's important to think about it. The flooding was an interesting one. I mean, I've done a lot of work with people involved in flooding where almost they gave a kind of personality to the floods, that the floods were intentionally coming. It was their fault. It's a very strange thing that people find it, they want to have someone to blame, and they will kind of see this as a sort of dynamic kind of influence that's causing it. So if people have these kind of attributions, these negative attributions, these can get in the way of recovery, in either that people hold on to their anger and they hold on to the trauma at the same time. And on the other side, if they feel guilty or shame about something that they should have done in order to help somebody, and perhaps someone committed suicide, maybe I could have helped them, or my family member is still, I'm still missing them. If I let go of that pain that I'm experiencing in some way, that I don't feel that they matter as much as perhaps they do. So knowing how people see the incident is really important. Just want to go back a bit in history about where disasters and how we've dealt with disasters over a long period of time. And essentially there are two streams of ways of dealing with disasters. And the first one, for those of you that know about your history of trauma, will know about the Coconut Grove fire, which was a fire that occurred in a nightclub in Boston during the time that they had prohibition. It was a kind of speakeasy where there's a lot of drinking going on. They'd decorated the whole building in kind of artificial palm trees and things like that. And there was about 1,000 people in this club at this time, and they set fire to some of the decorations, and unfortunately some of the fire escapes were locked, so people couldn't escape, and a lot of people died. Almost 500 people died in that fire. So that was the civilian, a very important civilian disaster. The other kind of disasters in history that we know about are the ones related to war and the situations in war. And the term shell shock started being used to describe those people that had been involved in some incident in war where they hadn't been injured, but they had been affected by a shell being fired, and they seemed to have some kind of psychological reaction to that event. And initially there was a kind of explanation that was given to that, which was that this is related to their brains being shaken in a particular way, and that's why it caused it, because there was they wanted a physiological explanation for the reaction. And they were looking at sort of spinal problems and nervous system problems rather than anything psychological. So we had these two streams coming in. And Eric Lindemann was the person that mainly looked at the Coconut Grove fire, and he saw what was happening as a form of grief rather than anything else. He didn't, when he was looking at all the people involved, he didn't explore anything about what had happened, not the situational factors. He just looked at the losses that the people had experienced. So it was very much looking at the victims from that point of view. And he saw that the victims were in this state of crisis and disorganized, and they're having great difficulties in getting over their upset. And he developed an approach to dealing with them, which was person-centered and was focused on increasing their resilience. So that was the civilian model. On the other side, we had Abraham Gardner, who was trained by Freud. He'd had previously been kind of involved with physiology and an anthropologist, and he looked at victims of the First World War, and he began to interpret the symptoms that he'd actually identified in terms of his work with Freud. So we've got this kind of reinterpretation of what the symptoms meant. And he identified a number of symptoms: the startling and irritability, aggression, fixation, not being able to function well, and having bad dreams. And it was his work that went into the first DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which was called Gross Stress Reaction. So that's the precursor of PTSD. And that's the cover of that document. So Gardner really was critical in establishing the nature of PTSD, and later on that's the model that came into DSM. It was interesting that in the second version of DSM, it was taken out. I think they got cold feet about psychological trauma because they, I don't know quite why, but they took it out and then they put it back in again. So what we've got are two models of trauma support going back, really a long time, so 70, 80 years, with Lindemann developing this, dealing with the ongoing traumatizing situation with a resilience-focused approach, building resilience groups where you're dealing with the sort of compassion fatigue and burnout. So this is that was one model. And then Gardner's model, much more trauma-focused, where you're looking at soothing and safety and support and demobilizing, diffusing and debriefing. And I think we've still got these two strands coming through in the way that we deal with trauma, and in some way I think we need to bring them together so that they talk to each other, because it isn't useful having models where they're, it's either this or that. No, I think they're both dealing with very similar things, and that's what I'd like to try and explain to you. So if you take psychological first aid that comes from the Lindemann side, this is the kind of framework that Hopful uses. So he talks about initially making sure that people are safe, removing them from the source of the danger or harm, providing, food, shelter, very much at the baseline of the hierarchy of needs, making sure that they're getting support and that they've got simple information. It's a very important part of looking after people after a disaster or any other trauma. The second thing that the psychological first aid model does is try to calm people, to be able to stabilize them, to reduce the effect of the stressful situations they've been in, to be able to listen to what they've got to say about what's happened, and to provide accurate information about the disaster or trauma and what's going on to help them and could be available to them. The next part is very much social, in helping people to connect back with their groups, their friends, their families, to bring people together, and to recognise that different cultures and different groups require different kinds of support. So you wouldn't be providing the same support for a group of police officers as you would for a family, as you would for different groups within society. And you need to be linking people with the services that are available. The next phase is making sure that people have the skills to deal with their own needs and to help them to make the right decisions for them, not telling them what to do, but facilitating that. And then with this final bit, which is the hope and expectancy of recovery, I think one of the nice things about trauma is it's not like lots of other psychological conditions where actually recovery isn't possible. You know, you're just treating symptoms all of the time. My experience is for most people that have been through a trauma, you recover from the trauma. You know, the likelihood of people being traumatized for the rest of their lives is quite small. Most people recover. And I think giving that message is really important, particularly in the first period. You know, when I talk to people, they are very often terrified of their symptoms, and it's important to help them to realise that these symptoms generally are temporary and that people will get over them. What I've put here is the alternative view that is actually coming from the debriefing side, which is, in fact, identical to what was in psychological first aid, in that you undertake an assessment, you provide physical support, social support, emotional support, and psychological support, and you take action. So this is the principle behind critical incident stress management. So I really don't see any difference between that first stage. These are some checklists that I use in the various organisations in order to help people deal with those early stages. And I mean, you can use them, but these ones are looking at, first of all, undertaking a risk assessment to work out what is the impact of what people are going through, in order, if you're managing that, to work out what is your plan of action. So identifying all of the potential things that can go wrong. So it's absolutely straightforward risk assessment stuff that anyone who does health and safety risk assessment would do. What I tend to do with this is not only look at the physical, but also, because I'm working in organisation, is to look at the organisational risk assessment, where you're looking at, you know, what is the likelihood of the media causing problems? What is the likelihood of us having the right resources and the right people in the right place? So you need to be able to do all of that. What we do in the organisations where I work is also train line managers to be able to do demobilising, so that at the end of an incident or at the end of the day, that there is somebody there that goes through a process of kind of finding out how the person is coping, giving them an opportunity to talk about what's happened to them, and then telling them what support would be available. So generally a 10-minute talk at the end of a day, so people never go off shift without having spoken about this. I'm desperately trying to get this into the emergency services where I work as a kind of regular feature, so that line managers do this all of the time, checking up and making sure that the people that they work with are fine. Because what I know from my experience of working in disasters, the one thing that matters the most is, how did my manager deal with me? Did they ask how I was after something that I've done that was difficult? Because if you're not asked by your line manager, it doesn't matter how good help further down the track is, it will never get over the fact that my manager didn't care about me. And then I've also put up the group debriefing checklist, which is, again, something that is done by the line manager, just again a little bit more in depth in how you would find out if people are okay, allowing them to talk about what has happened without any pressure and without kind of any deep investigation, but just allowing them to talk about the things in a group about what's happened. So this is the model that I introduce in organisations. So as you can see, the first two are the psychological first aid. So this is the first bit, is the psychological first aid, and it's absolutely vital. And then the second part, the debriefing, or whatever you call it, some people do trim, whatever, that it is that much more structured telling of the trauma story, the trauma-focused element of it, which is also very often found in the trauma counselling if you're doing trauma-focused CBT, because that's the trauma-focused bit. It's going through the story in a way that people can understand it and make sense of it. And that generally is not done for a month. Can I just say something about watchful waiting? Because I don't keep a script, when I think of things, I actually say what I think. I don't know where watchful waiting came from. I don't think there's been any study on psychological interventions which has said watchful waiting has been researched, or there's not been any kind of evaluation of what's the benefit of watchful waiting. I don't even know what it means. But what I do know is that with the Grenfell fire, I had some of the groups the sort of survivor groups, the victim groups, got in touch with me, who'd said that they'd gone to see their GPs, and the GPs said, well, we can't do anything for you for a month. And I'm sure that is not the right answer, because at the very least you should be doing the psychological first aid. At the very least you should be doing that. So I don't know what watchful waiting means, but if that's what it means, you do nothing for a month, that is not a good message to go out, because it makes people really feel that they're not being cared about. I'm sure you know this, the criteria for developing PTSD, that you've got to witness an event that's happened to either yourself or others, or you learn about it if you're a close family member. But the important bit is the bit that I've put in red, which is experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to the aversive details of a traumatic event as a first responder, police officer, and others exposed to the detail of child abuse when it's work-related. Now that, as far as I know, I mean, I was in court very soon after this was developed, supporting a police officer who had actually been dealing with child abuse case, and I had to make the case for him not to be forced to go to court, because he wasn't able to deal with the case that he was dealing with because of his own trauma or his own experience of trauma. But I think that going forward, as case law is established, I think that there will be situations where people, again, like yourselves, who are dealing with trauma all of the time as part of your job, may experience or may be able to get a diagnosis of PTSD if you've been doing this kind of work consistently. I don't know, it hasn't been established yet, but I think it's important that we are aware of this, which is why it's really important that if you're working in an organisation, that the organisations are aware of their responsibility. Because if you aren't providing support for people who may be secondarily traumatised in this way, then what is your defence if you haven't got reasonable programmes in place? I guess you all know about the symptoms, the re-experience symptoms, which really defines PTSD, the intrusive memories, the flashbacks, the intense distress that people feel, and the re-experience of the kind of physiological responses that people have, which kind of has moved out of the arousal section into this section. It was the last version of DSM-5 was a bit of a shuffle around, I think, more than anything else. Hyperarousal, which affects people a lot, and then this really odd group that they put in, which kind of was all of the odds and ends that I think didn't fit in anywhere else. So you've got this dissociation, the inability to remember parts of the trauma, the negative beliefs and expectations, distorted thinking, blaming, loss of interest in the future, detachment, inability to feel positive emotions. They're all really important. Whether they hang together conceptually, I'm not really certain. I don't really think they do. But I think they're important that we have them there because actually we see them all of the time if we deal with trauma. And then the two, avoidance. I don't know about you, but I actually I'm a biologist by training. Before I was a psychologist, I was a biologist. And actually, I love explaining psychology as a biologist because to me, what it means is that it kind of is, that's how it is. And it's much easier to accept that actually that's how my brain works and that's why I've got these issues. So the way that trauma works is that you have all of the sensory information coming into your thalamus, which kind of is the CPU of the brain or the hub or whatever you want to call it. So everything goes into there, including the sensations and feelings, but more than just feelings, it's all the stuff that's going on inside of your body and your body's reaction. There's a massive body-mind connection in trauma. And the information then goes into the amygdala, which is primed to pick up traumatic events, given that it already has some when we're born. So for those of you that have studied psychology, you remember all of the experiments with the children and the going across a gap where looks like there's a kind of big drop, and children will not go over because of the drop, because they're fearful of falling down. It's kind of interesting that they did that experiment with animals as well, so puppies and kittens did exactly the same thing. So we have this inbuilt, innate fear of certain things, which are all the things that we know in people that have phobias, so it's fears of spiders, of snakes, of heights, of open spaces. So all of those early things are actually already in the amygdala when we're born. The only creature that didn't worry about the gap or the fall were ducks. Ducklings jumped, but were very surprised when they found it wasn't water. So they were. So the amygdala gathers all of the information that is coming through, and it recognizes when there are things that are traumatic, mainly because the thalamus increases the magnitude or the kind of velocity of the information hitting the amygdala. So the amygdala becomes absolutely full of energy. And if that energy went into the cortex, then you'd have an epileptic fit. I mean, that's just how it works. So because we can't really afford to have an epileptic fit in the middle of a disaster, what we've got is the fuse that blows, and that's made up of thin-walled neurons which just burst. So we now got information stuck in the amygdala. We can't get it into the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that actually makes the information available to be processed in the cortex, and we lose the contact with the prefrontal cortex, which can allow us to calm ourselves down. So we've got a bit of a problem now when the fuse goes. So just really, I thought it was quite interesting for you to see that this is what a fuse looks like in reality. This is an electron microscope picture of that fuse. And when the fuse goes, what happens biologically is there's a deregulation of the arousal system. And that acts like, if you have normally under a stress, you have high adrenaline, your cortisol comes up to kind of balance it. The levels in a trauma get kind of set at the wrong level, so it's like the thermostat set at the wrong level, and what you get is people that are in a situation, if you can imagine a situation where you've got an aircraft at the end of a runway, the pilot revs up the aircraft, you've got lots of energy in the aircraft and you can actually feel that potential energy there, they take off the brake and the aircraft shoots forward. So that's what people who are traumatized are feeling like all of the time, that they're on that edge of setting off down the runway. So it's really important that we are aware of that and that we are able to explain to people this is what's happening and this is why you find it so difficult to manage your emotional reactions, because you're just on the cusp all of the time of either being held back or rushing forward with the effect. People also find it very difficult to find words to explain themselves, and this is because when the fuse blows, the language centers, which are on the cortex of your brain, get switched off. So it's really difficult for people to be able to say what's going on in your mind, and that's really frustrating. So you may see this in your clients, the people that you're dealing with, in that you ask them a question and they kind of can't tell you. This is really important with people like the police officers that I work with, because if they can't keep people calm, then they're not going to be able to get very good evidence. So they need to be able to maintain that calm. People's memories are affected so that they can't recall things, which is important to you because if you are dealing with someone and you are giving them some advice, something that they should be able to do, when they go home, they won't remember. So it's important that you write things down so that they've got something to go with you, or have leaflets to explain the symptoms. Re-experience happens because the amygdala, although it's a very primitive part of the brain, it doesn't have any intelligence. It just reacts and responds, but it's absolutely desperate to try and help you deal with the situation. And it wants to look after you best it can. So the only way that it can actually do that is by representing to you the only information that it's got, which is sensory. So it will continue to represent sensory information in order that you take notice of it, and it is then confident that you're going to be able to cope in the future. So it will keep on doing that until the situation has been resolved. And because people find all of the other symptoms so difficult and upsetting, there is this process of dissociation where people stop having the emotions that go with the event that they've been through. Very adaptive, it's something that we learn and something that continues to happen once we've learnt it, which is why in a lot of the cases of dissociation you will see people doing things like self-harming, because actually being dissociated is probably one of the most painful things to experience, is that that feeling of being numb doesn't feel great at all, and so if you cut yourself or do something else against, that causes the reaction, you get a sense of feeling for a short period of time. So the problem with the amygdala memories is that over time they don't fade. I've dealt with people who've been traumatized 20, 30, 40 years previously, and the memories of the incident that they were involved with are just as vivid now as they were at the time. So when you're talking to them, it's as if they're there. It doesn't alter. The memories in the amygdala aren't available to us directly. So they are there, they're hidden, they're outside our awareness, but we respond to them. They're unstable. So they're communicated to us in dreams, in flashbacks, in physical responses. So it's the way that the amygdala communicates is through sensory information. So that's what we're dealing with all of the time. And they can lie dormant for very long periods until they're re-triggered by something else that happens that reminds them of the trauma, and then they can come back in total. They're not intelligent, and they're linked to what's going on in our body. So there's very often there is a physiological element of memory that is held, so the body holds some of the memories. So when a traumatic event happens, anything that was present at the time can be connected with the trauma. So this is, classical conditioning, for you remember back in your initial training in psychology. So it could be the time of day, it could be what the weather condition was like, it could be the actual place, it could be a smell, it could be a sound, it could be other people that were around. Just anything around the event can trigger a response to the traumatic event, because the amygdala doesn't see which bit of this was traumatic. Everything was traumatic because they're connected in that event. Does that make sense? Yeah? So how do we move the sensory memories that are causing all the problems out of the amygdala without blowing the fuse again? So this is actually all we are doing in our trauma therapy. We're trying to get those memories out into the conscious memory so that then we can deal with them. So what's important is to teach people how to relax, how to self-soothe, so that there's less likelihood of them blowing the fuse. If you focus on the facts and the physical sensations instead of focusing on the cognitive stuff, then it's more likely that we can get those through because they're not so tied to emotions. So if you start focusing on feelings and irrational thoughts in particular, you'll just keep blowing the fuse. So focus on the factual information and the physical sensations by identifying with the person what had happened. You start at a safe place so that they get that sense of safety before this incident happened. You take them through the story a little bit at a time, making sure that they don't, that they don't get over upset. And you use a lot of paraphrasing, reflecting, and summarizing, and then you end at a safe place again. So it's important, I think, whenever you're dealing with a traumatic event, is that you go through what actually happened, but you have safety at each end, and you kind of tie those safety periods into the story. There's a lot of controversy about debriefing, and you're probably aware of those. There is absolutely no reliable evidence that debriefing is harmful. There's only one study that was related to burns victims, which was undertaken by Jonathan Bisson, which showed any possibility of harm. On the basis of that, debriefing more or less was stopped in most organisations because of the fears of what would happen if you did it. That prevented any further research into the area of early interventions. What we do know is that debriefing is highly valued by participants, the people that come together for debriefing. And there's the other thing to think about is that there is no reliable evidence on any other early interventions being any more effective. So we've got a situation where we need to do something, but we're not really looking at it because, in a way, NICE has stopped us. And that is not a sensible situation to be in. There is a debriefing-like process, which is a key element of trauma-focused CBT. So there is debriefing within trauma-focused CBT. And without it, CBT doesn't work with trauma. You need trauma-focused CBT, which looks at the trauma itself. What I'm doing with the BPS and the Crisis, Disaster and Trauma section is that we are looking to undertake some research into early interventions because for policing and for any other organisation where there's a lot of trauma potential, we do need to have an intervention. And what I'm interested in finding is one of the key elements of any of these interventions which are actually helpful. Because I do not see any point in having a big argument about psychological first aid, debriefing, trim, or anything else, because actually there's a lot of common elements in all of them. So let's agree what the common elements are, and for goodness sake, can we please develop a model that is useful, that everyone can use. Right. I've only got 15 minutes, I think, so I'm going to speed up. Right. Professional quality of life. I don't know whether you use this questionnaire, but it's quite a useful one for secondary trauma, where you're looking at compassion satisfaction, which is really, really important in making people more resilient. If you enjoy your job, if you see some purpose in your job, and that you get something out of it, you're going to be much more resilient in actually dealing with it. On the negative side, people can experience compassion fatigue, which is emotional exhaustion from dealing with angry, distressed, upset people. There's burnout, which has 3 symptoms: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, loss of self-esteem. And secondary trauma, which is where it's different to compassion fatigue. Secondary trauma is where you are starting to experience this kind of symptoms that your clients are experiencing. So if you're dealing with, the arena terrorist attack, you will start having flashbacks or dreams or thinking about being in a similar situation. So that's secondary trauma as opposed to compassion fatigue, which is just feeling generally tired. What I'd like to say here, because I'm an occupational health psychologist, is that the organisations that you work in are also important. Organisations are responsible for managing and creating the right work environment. You need to have the right kind of relationships with your colleagues and with your clients, and your personal experiences, particularly if they're traumatic, need to be managed. Now, if all of those are positive, then you're going to have compassion satisfaction, which is great, and that's the aim. But if they're negative, the increasing likelihood is that you'll develop compassion fatigue and burnout. And if people are exposed to secondary trauma, to traumatized clients, then you also are likely to experience that as well. What I'd suggest is that you need to be measuring that sort of thing in your teams to make sure that they're okay. So compassion fatigue is found in people engaged in caring for people who are distressed or angry. It's more common in people that have got high levels of emotional empathy, and it's also found, it can create depression and all sorts of other things. Just a little bit about cognitive and emotional empathy, and you probably know about it. I hope I'm not teaching you stuff you don't know, but it's really important that if you're empathetic, you're much more likely to get compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. That it's really important to have these kind of relationships, but cognitive empathy is the safer empathy to have. And cognitive empathy is understanding what the person is experiencing. So I understand their situation cognitively. I understand what it feels like to be in that situation. But I don't feel it, because that's emotional empathy. If you have emotional empathy with all of your clients, all the people you work with, you're going to get burnt out really quickly, because it's wearing to have all this kind of physiological stuff going on all of the time, that you're engaging, you're feeling all the time for people. And so it's important that you try to learn how to develop cognitive empathy so you protect yourself. This is a drawing, a very simplified drawing from Sacha Baron Cohen's work on empathy, on the empathy circuit. And initially I used his work looking at people with Asperger's. He's got a questionnaire that he used for Asperger's. Not because I was looking particularly for Asperger's, but I was looking for the other end of the this kind of continuum, because if people have got very, very high levels of empathy, then they're much more vulnerable to develop secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. What's interesting about the empathy circuit is that each of the parts that are labelled on the diagram is a kind of link in this circuit, and if any one of them fail, then people begin to lose empathy, and this is where you find that people become dissociated and don't care about their patients anymore. So it's important that you maintain your empathy, but you need to do it within limits. So if you've got secondary trauma, as I said, this is being exposed to traumatic images, stories or materials. And in my world, a lot of the evidence of secondary trauma is coming out of people that are reading reports of trauma. So you don't actually have to talk to somebody. If you read a report or you hear a tape of someone talking about the trauma they've been in, what people do is they try and make sense of it. So if you're reading a report of something really horrendous that has happened, what you would do as a human being is create images in your mind about what that looks like. When you're doing that, what you tend to do is to add in those things which are relevant to you. So if you are, in the case of some of my people dealing with child abuse, if you read about a testimony of a child talking about what happened to them, and they're talking about being abused in a particular room in a house, you will create that room in your mind, but you will put in things which are relevant to your house without even realizing it. So it's possible then that you can start having reactions to rooms in your house that you've kind of, without realizing it, put into the trauma. I put this one in really only to say one of the big issues that we've got is that, although the human brain is very complicated, it doesn't do things it doesn't need to do twice. So the tracts that are taking imagination and reality are the same tracts in the brain. So we can't tell the difference between what was real and what we really imagined, particularly if we put in lots of sensory information. And so it's very difficult sometimes for the brain to know which bit was real and which bit wasn't. So it's very easy for us to have secondary trauma responses. So people who've got very vivid imaginations, who are highly empathetic, who are sensitive personalities, or who notice something that's familiar with a disaster to something that they already know, or who are exhausted, are much more likely to develop secondary trauma. So, for example, in the 7/7 disaster, terrorist attack, I did some research immediately following, and we found that the people that were on site, the police officers that were on site for more than 10 hours, had higher levels of PTSD, and there was a direct correlation with the number of hours and the amount of PTSD. So after that, we decided it was important that there was a people person responsible for looking after people on the site, so that people were sent home after a certain period of time, so you didn't get this exhaustion happening. Organisationally, how do you notice when people are secondary traumatised? And I'm a great believer that organisations are just like people. They suffer trauma in the same way. So what do you see in organisations? You see people who are unable to, through experience, you see people that are unable to switch off from their work. That when you go home, you're still having thoughts about it. That you have dreams and flashbacks about the things that were experienced by other people. You start overreacting to work-related issues and reenacting some of the things that the victims have experienced. So you have, if you're dealing with victims that felt hopeless and helpless, you may absorb some of that feeling of hopeless and helplessness and not being able to deal with things. In the workplace, you may see people becoming irritable, angry, very much, they can focus that either at home, so they can become quite difficult at home, and their spouses, partners begin to get fed up of them. or their colleagues or the situations. They can become self-destructive, they can be very sort of jumpy and irritable and not be able to concentrate. So you may see that in the workplace, and people will not necessarily recognize that actually this is because they've done too much work. People can start feeling bad about themselves, that they're incompetent in some ways. They can feel negative about life in general and just feel numb and not really wanting to do the work anymore. And then on avoidance, they may start not putting off things at work, not wanting to deal with difficult and demanding cases because actually they're exhausted. So look out for the signs of secondary trauma in your colleagues if you're dealing with this kind of event. I think I'll leave burnout. So what should organisations be doing? As an occupational psychologist, you need to be looking at what is our focus, and lots of the focus very often is at tertiary level. It's actually doing things for people. But what is really important is that we look at all the levels. We look at the primary levels, look at the way that the organisation deals with situations, and that we do our planning, that we organise things properly, that we have the right level of communication, and that the organisation is trauma informed. I've actually put other things in. You will get a copy of this so you can look this up for yourself. There needs to be secondary interventions, which is training in leadership, in dealing with crisis management. There needs to be induction training, and then we have the similar things on the employee side before we start doing all the tertiary. And if we did more of the primary and the secondary, it is my view that there would be a lot fewer problems at the tertiary level. So it's a good practice to deal with primary and secondary in your planning. This is a kind of diagram of an online surveillance program that I've put in place in a number of organisations, where we're looking at how are people doing, so that we're screening them, identifying how many are fit, how many need to be seen by an occupational health nurse or RMN, and how many people need to be seen by a psychologist. So this process is part of the triage and very effective in reducing the amount of workload. Just to give you some ideas of how things are in different groups, these are some of the data that we've got from doing our screening, and as you can see, at the far end you've got the public health, the sort of general public scores in comparison to some of the groups that I work with. So online child abuse where they're dealing with frontline cases, family liaison officers, humanitarians, and youth safeguarding. You can see, say, for example, the humanitarian level of anxiety, depression, virtually everything is very high in humanitarians. And they have very little support, actually, generally. This here is an interesting chart, which is something you might think about. This is something looking at workability, which is a measure developed in Finland to see how people saw their fitness and well-being going forward. And as you can see, there's an absolute clear correlation between the levels of workability. So if the workability is poor, you can see that the level of primary trauma, compassion, fatigue, anxiety, and depression are all above, and it absolutely directly correlates with people's conditions. So it's a useful tool to use in identifying what's going on in organisations. I think we need to be looking at trauma training and who should be trained. There doesn't seem to be any kind of real plan on how we deal with trauma. It's the view of the Crisis, Disaster and Trauma section that all psychologists, as part of their training, should get information on trauma. It should be part of every undergraduate study, and perhaps every study in anyone that's going to deal with trauma in part of their work. There needs then to be trauma-skilled people, which I guess would be people like yourselves who are able to provide counselling services and evidence-based interventions. And then there needs to be the expert level, which is the sort of PhD level of people that can provide direction and guidance in doing that. I'm really keen that together, with organisations like your own, with the BPS and others, that we go forward in trying to create and get the universities and the educators to develop this kind of framework to allow people to know what the level of training and skills are. Because, to be perfectly frank, when I heard after Grenfell that one organisation had asked for help and 300 counsellors turned up, all wishing to offer their services, very few of whom had had any training in trauma work at all. So what kind of interventions were they offering? What are we telling the public? I don't know. It isn't right to say a counsellor is coming, because a counsellor is not somebody who necessarily can deal with trauma. We also need to look at the research into trauma interventions. As I said, we're trying to put together this program with the College of Policing. We want to know which trauma therapy works and which is the best. The real problem with dealing with trauma is that it doesn't happen in the laboratory, and it's very difficult to get random controlled trials that you can do for trauma work. So we need to have models which are going to produce the reasonable evidence that will be impressive enough to get a change in the way we deal with things. And one of the other things that I'm personally involved with, and I don't know whether you're probably okay because you're connected to the NHS, but as a practitioner, because I'm not part of the NHS and I'm not part of a university, I cannot get my papers published because I don't have an ethics committee. So I'm working hard to get a practitioner's ethics committee, which is going to be housed within the BPS. So for anybody who's working independently, it's really important, I think, that practitioners' research is actually being reported. And finally, and I hope I haven't gone over my time, but I'm probably about there, can I just say, can you look after yourselves? This work is not easy. It does affect you. It is important that you have the right level of supervision, professional and managerial. You do need to reflect and make sense of what you're doing. And actually, taking exercise, having hobbies, and having a healthy diet, from the research I've done, is really good in keeping you well. So, hope this has been interesting to you. Thank you for listening.